Thanks, Tom, for that very nice introduction, and thanks to the Asian Institute for inviting me. It's great to be here in Toronto and seeing all of you, and letting me talk about this very early project of mine. I was a kind of a rank amateur, I guess, in terms of my photography career when I started this project. If we think back to the dawn of history, pre-internet, around 1985, I completely stumbled across the walled city. I heard about it. It was some mythical place in Hong Kong that you're not supposed to go. It was supposed to be very different than the rest of Hong Kong, much more dangerous and dire in every way. I've never seen a photograph of it. I'd never met a person who'd ever been there. It was just one of these things about Hong Kong that existed that you never come across it in normal, polite society. In 1985, I was photographing around the end of the runway at Kai Tak Airport, one of the last of Asia's great downtown airports. The runway stuck out into Kowloon Bay, and the approach was over Kowloon, the very built-up urban area, and then the plane would make a hard right turn at about 200 feet to line up with the runway. So it was a fantastic place to stand and watch aircraft go by it just over the rooftops, and I was trying to make pictures of that extraordinary scene. When I went around a corner and at the end of the block saw this building thing that didn't fit in with anything else around it or anything else in the city or in any other city for that matter. It was this extraordinary facade glowing at night. At the time, it was surrounded by a squatter village, something that was very common in Hong Kong in those days. All over the territory, up and down the mountainsides on Hong Kong Island and elsewhere, squatter villages were still a feature. They were not all that ramshackle. They were permanent for the most part, but very ad hoc, that homemade quality that squatter villages have. And the walled city shared quite a lot of that, sort of a homemade look to it. And I think that's why it was such a startling thing to look at, because you know that nobody had any permission to do it. And so how could it be that this place without permission was built in the middle of Hong Kong? That's tied up with its history as a piece of real estate that wasn't included in the treaty between Britain and China that ceded Hong Kong to Britain. So it was technically a part of China in the middle of Kowloon. At the time, Kowloon was a completely rural area, and this piece of territory was exempt from the treaty because it was where Qing Dynasty troops were garrisoned and where a magistrate traveling in the region would hear court cases. So the British agreed to exempt that little piece of land and its wall from the treaty. I'm going to play something now, which I hope you'll find entertaining. It's a clip from Bloodsport, starring the muscles from Brussels, Jean-Claude Van Damme. I'm going to show it because it's how a lot of people discovered the walled, one of the ways that people discovered the walled city, completely by chance.
Here it comes, man. The walled city. Not a place for outsiders. You are in Hong Kong, but you are about to cross an invisible border into mainland China. No joke, man. It's a rundown piece of no man's land in the middle of a tourist paradise. Goes way back to the old lease agreement between Great Britain and China. Once you step out of the sunlight into the narrow corridors, it's time to protect your nuts, guys. 呢兩個係嚟打擂台美國旗州嘅，有冇睇下你係？OK USA。
administrative and crime enforcement was much lower there than the neighboring community. Basically, enforcement for serious crimes did take place even in the early days, but for things like health and safety, business licenses, that sort of thing, it wasn't enforced. There was a sort of a myth about the walled city that the police never went there, but that's actually not true. They did go there. In the early days, they had to go in two-man teams, but later it was patrolled in a quite normal fashion. It's just the businesses and health and safety rules weren't enforced there, which led to some interesting situations, which I'll talk about later. So this is a barbecued meat factory. There was no slaughtering of animals that took place there. That happened outside, but the food factories would bring them in and then process them. When I started this project, one of the first things that became clear was that it wasn't quite like people talked about it. It had this reputation for vice, for drugs and prostitution. But by the time I started photographing there in the 1980s, it was more or less like any other working class neighborhood of Hong Kong. Drug use did take place there, but I wouldn't say on any level different from what happened elsewhere in working class Hong Kong. At the same time, because of the history of the place, it did have a period where drugs, prostitution, and other vice and illegal activity did flourish there, mostly in the 1950s and 60s. But so I didn't want to ignore that, and I wanted to make pictures of that. I didn't happen to know any drug users, and I wasn't one myself, so I needed some help with that. And that help came through a British missionary, an English woman named Jackie Pullinger, who for many years ran a clinic in the walled city and a kind of social outreach, informal group, who was very, very active and very successful in bringing people in without questions, and ultimately getting them off drugs through kind of religion, tough love, and cold turkey. So she really was very successful, a wonderful force of life in that place, and she continues to work in Hong Kong to this day. Here's a little survey that the police compiled in the 50s, talking about what was going on inside there. So they did a survey that showed there were 648 stone buildings and 152 wooden huts, and within these buildings were 120 narcotic divans, 20 brothels, 5 gambling houses, 18 eating houses, 9 weaving factories, 9 dentists, 94 shops dealing in miscellaneous goods, 4 schools, 3 right wing, 1 left wing. It goes on to say, sanitation within the city is practically non-existent, and the area is filthy. Refuse is allowed to accumulate and has done so over a period of years. The place is swarming with mendicants suffering from all sorts of diseases. The prevention and detention of crime has been and remains a very grave problem. Action has been limited to arresting offenders summarily, fingerprinting, detaining for 48 hours, and then releasing with a warning, and then B, deporting the worst offenders, but deportation is becoming increasingly difficult. So that kind of, I think that's a very good indication of what went on there in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Here's a picture from the late 80s which shows some of the garbage having accumulated in the pipes and wires between the buildings just above head level. So the walled city offered opportunities to people who couldn't get a foothold in Hong Kong in any other way economically. Hong Kong was a city of migrants from southern China, and it remains so, I think, to this day, though, of course, the generations have changed, and that's one of the big differences, one of the big evolutions that's taken place. is this attachment to Hong Kong now, which we're seeing played out in the streets today. And perhaps we'll talk more about that later because it's such an ongoing and amazing thing. So you would operate in the walled city at a discount to what you'd be able to do just across the street. The trade-off, of course, is that no taxes, no rates to pay, no services. So you get a space at a discount, you live there or work there, set up a factory, no interference from the government, but the conditions are not great. You've probably seen pictures of the walled city, an aerial photograph taken by my colleague and co-author in our book, Ian Lambert. He did a picture from a helicopter in 1990, which shows an elevated view of the walled city with this donut hole in the middle of it. There was a couple places in the walled city that weren't covered, otherwise it was complete dense, massive building all standing against each other. That donut hole, which I'll show later, was actually the result of a church which took a piece of property, was given a piece of property that used to be part of the administrative building in the Qing dynasty. That was somehow, they managed to avoid developers taking that place over and building on top of it. The other one was this temple, where one assumes that its roof used to be covered with garbage thrown from the upper floors, but to address that, an iron grill was built over the top of it, and so that's what we're looking at. If you can see that, it's an iron grill with a little bit of a clearance in it where light is filtering through. This is what that grill looks like from the top side. So it's covered completely in trash, except for a little corner where it's been cleared away to let some of the light through. Again, one of the factories, a rubber plunger factory, a 1 or 2 man operation. The sole proprietor of the business. One of the things I did in the walled city was try to show it as a normal, functioning place with people trying to make a living, trying to educate their kids, trying to make a better life for themselves or just get by. And again, you have to remember that anything you'd heard about the walled city was always about what a dreadful place it was, what a nest of vice it was. If people people did bother to go there and make those kind of reports, but I found it astonishing, and to some extent still do, that people sort of resisted what their eyes were telling them, that this was actually quite a normal place in the sense of how it was arranged along quite traditional, almost village lines. At the time, I was working for magazines as a magazine photographer, photographing mostly for Time and Newsweek and Fortune and other businesses, talking about what was going on in the region, everything from the economic changes happening in Asia, to political unrest, to civil war, to executive portraits of 500 Fortune executives in Asia and elsewhere. So I decided to apply some of those techniques, studio lighting, to the residents there. Again, one needed to use lighting in there if you wanted to do something, I think, accurate and representative of the place. So I carried a lot of lighting around with me when I went about my business there, trying to photograph the people and the interiors. That police report noted that there were only 9 dentists operating in the walled city during that survey in the 50s, but there were hundreds operating in the walled city by the time I was photographing there in the 80s. Their credentials, their licenses had been gained in China. They were educated in China, but the licenses weren't recognized by the Hong Kong government. So to be able to practice, they were able to do that in the walled city because of the lack of regulation there. And it was a place where people from all over the territory did go to use their services. I did a lot of things in the walled city, but I didn't have my teeth fixed there. One of the food factories, this is a noodle maker's operation, a live workspace. So during the day, the husband and wife would make noodles, and at the end of the day they'd clear the workbench and their kids would do homework there, and then at the end of the day that's where the kids would sleep. I don't know if it shows in this picture, but it's abacus and telephones covered in flour from the noodle operation there. You didn't need to go outside the walled city for most of life's services and daily goods, but there's no reason not to go outside of the walled city as well. It's not as if people were kept in there or didn't want to leave it. It was very integrated with the rest of the place. But for daily goods, you perhaps didn't want to go far, so you could get them from various little stores scattered throughout the usually ground level places. This is that same shop with the wooden division between the living and working areas. A hairdresser. One of the many cafes and other kinds of eating places. This one has a little ladder that leads up to a sleeping area where the family around the place lived. Getting into the homes was always a little harder, just because it's that public-private blurring wasn't blurred, it was private, so harder to get into. And at the end, when I was assessing what I'd done so far, when I knew I wanted to make a book, I made a little bit more of an effort to try to get into the homes of people, and was helped with that by a young woman that Ian and I hired from Hong Kong University, a history graduate who worked with us for a couple of years compiling oral histories of the residents. And she was very useful in opening doors into people's homes to allow me to make some pictures of that side of life. The interiors were pretty grim if you didn't have a window. When you bought space in the walled city or rented it, it didn't actually provide a permanence of any view you might have had. So if you had a window, somebody could have built something next door and bricked up your window, and you didn't really have any recourse. The interior apartments, of course, were the most difficult ones to live in. No ventilation or windows, but the ones facing the exterior were quite pleasant, not unlike other apartments in the surrounding area. It's just that provisions weren't made to facilitate, by law, ventilation and all sorts of other normal features of apartment living. Here's the edge of that donut hole, looking across in the distance to the lights of Kowloon City. So this is up on the roof where a lot of the kids played after school, and the younger ones during the day who didn't go to school. People did their laundry up there and the rest of it. Yeah, it was very close to the approach into Kai Tak Airport. So it was actually quite an amazing spectacle up there to watch these giant planes kind of career past as they power down into nearby Kai Tak Airport. If any of you remember flying into Kai Tak, there was next to the walled city was this enormous orange checkerboard painted onto the side of a mountain that the pilots aimed for, basically, and then it was a manual approach into Hong Kong. You couldn't run an instrument approach into that airport, so it was all fly by hand into the city. So kids on the rooftop. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sharp things poking out all over the walled city at about eye level of an 8-year-old, but parents, allowed their kids to play up there, and one assumes it only made them tougher. I never heard of anything dire happening up there. It's a night view of the walled city aerials and the distant lights of Kai Tak Airport behind. One of the exterior, this side of Hong Kong, the north, kind of the northwest side, most resembled the surrounding neighborhood, except for the dentist signs, which were a big feature of the place. So here's that aerial view, which shows the density, over 300 interconnected buildings, and rising up to about 14 floors. The only regulation that the Hong Kong government enforced was a height restriction because of the proximity to the runway at Kai Tak. So anybody who tried to build anything over 14 floors, the urban services folks dispatched a unit to tear that down, and that more or less stuck to the end. It topped out at 14 floors. Just to the top left of the frame, you see an early version of Hong Kong housing estate, and then on the top right, the newer version. So this is in 1989, 1990. In doing the research for the new book, which has just come out, called City of Darkness Revisited, we commissioned a number of writers to look at various aspects of the walled city, its history, its meaning in Hong Kong, and its strange path into popular culture. Its history is complicated and compromised to the extent that people called the place San Bu Guan, triply neglected. And so that means neglected by the local administration of Hong Kong, by the colonial government in London, and by Beijing, who were its nominal overseers. I mean, Beijing stayed very clear of Kowloon walled city affairs, but the British government, the Hong Kong administration, never knew what might be a kind of a tripwire to invite some kind of response from Beijing. So to play it safe, they just kept well away from it. The only real enforcement was done with serious crime, and they tested the waters in the 1960s when a murder was committed there, and the police went in and made an arrest, and Beijing had no problem with that. In other words, there was no response. I think there might have actually been a consultation about that between London and Beijing, and but other things did draw a response from Beijing. Also in the 60s, the government tried to tear down a little piece of it, and Beijing sort of wagged their fingers saying, no, you can't do that. So they stepped back, and that continued right to the end, where in normal administrative matters, the government stayed very clear of it. One of the writers that we were very happy to have write for us is a writer named Loy Tai Lok, who talks about that triply neglected feature of the walled city. He calls it a truly unique place, a zone of limbo amid a mass of people. And that term, triply neglected, neither the colonial administration of Hong Kong or the PRC and British governments could intervene or administer it in a high-profile way. In the eyes of many people, this community forms an institutional vacuum, a place where anything could happen within its confines. Because of this political history of being triply neglected, the notion of the walled city as a seedy, anarchic den ridden with vice became very persuasive. And also because of this background, it inspired limitless flights of fancy. And so some of those flights of fancy have played out in popular culture. At the time, it was hard to anticipate that anybody might find this place worthy as a kind of exploration of what a city could become, an inspiration even, or just for in atmospheric terms as a kind of a model. The director of Batman Begins, Christopher Nolan, sampled the walled city in his recreation of a bad neighborhood of Gotham City in that movie. So his production designer fashioned this 80-foot by 40-foot model, which is based largely on the walled city. And this is what the park that replaced the wall today. This area of Kowloon now has high-rise buildings because the airport has moved. But that rough sketch, that parallelogram thing, is roughly where the walled city stood. And the park today has a small kind of commemoration of the walled city being there, though when the park was completed, back in the 1990s, there was actually nothing to register that the walled city had even been there. So people kept turning up and asking, where's something about the walled city? And so belatedly the government responded and built a small kind of mini, not quite museum, but a little building, a little commemoration of the walled city. Some of the residents hang around there and talk to people who come by, so you can still hear first-person accounts of life in the walled city if you go to the park and linger and talk to one of these people. So I'll leave it there with that. So thank you.